Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We have the pleasure of having our friends from KPMG with us. Christian Leva will be presenting on navigating security and controls for small teams. And as a reminder, we do encourage you to ask questions during our presentation. So feel free to either raise your hand or you can type them into the Q&A channel box and we will answer them as we go along and at the end of our session. So now I'm going to turn it over to Christian to kick off our presentation.
Yeah, thank you, and I welcome everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to be speaking with y'all today, and hopefully we've got a good conversation for you today. As Angie mentioned, if you have any questions or if you have any comments or anything, feel free to toss them into the chat or maybe even come off mute, whatever mechanism you have. Want to make it as interactive as possible. It's a small crowd today, so no need to get it all death by PowerPoint type of deal. Just a quick intro to myself. As Angie mentioned, I'm one of our leaders in our application risk practice at KPMG. Uh, I had the pleasure of working with our teams who do implementations of application layer security and integrated controls and continuous monitoring mechanisms for a wide variety of applications, including Oracles and NetSuites and Dynamics and Workdays of the world. And then at the same time, I get to wear another hat, which is on the audit and compliance side, working with external and internal audit teams to develop the people, process, and technologies around evaluating if our IT application layer controls are effective, if they're designed properly, and if they're not, working with them to design better ones. As a sidebar, I've had a pretty interesting career. I've worked with a number of different consulting companies, started with Accenture, went to PwC, now at KPMG. And then prior to that, I bounced around a few different career paths, most notably as a game programmer and designer. So I'm a techie by trade. I'm a programmer. It's one of my guilty pleasures. I don't know how many people you know who could say that programming is something they do for fun. That is me. Outside of that, live in Dallas, Texas. Got three beautiful kids, a 7 and twin boys who are now 5. So if I appear tired, that's why. So, again, pleasure to be talking with y'all. For those of you who don't know me, y'all can find me on LinkedIn, and I try to do various podcasts and webcasts or write various articles around the topic that we're going to be talking about today. And it's an interesting one because it's one that I often get asked a lot about, especially after doing presentations or speaking at conferences. Folks will come up to me and say, "Hey, look, I get it. There's a lot of risk out there. Security is top of mind for me. Controls, I know we need controls, but I have 25 people in my entire financial business team, right? I got 25 users. We're on NetSuite or we're on Dynamics. I'd love to be able to have all of these sophisticated controls, but I feel like if I implement all this security that you're recommending, or I've implemented all these controls, I'm going to have a team of 25 people just to maintain the other 25 people." So where is that balance? What makes sense for my organization when I have only a handful of folks? Is there something that I can do right now that will protect our application systems from threats, both internally and externally, that will allow me to grow as well for the future when we do get to a point where hopefully we are a larger organization, if that's something we're striving to be. And we're getting into a point where maybe we're doing pre-IPO or we're going to a private equity where now they do require more advanced things. I want to be ready for that, but in a smaller, more contained area. So that's what we're going to be talking about today is what are those bare minimum things that you can do? But I would be remiss if I didn't do a little bit of fear mongering to remind everybody of why we have to care about this stuff in the first place. And the answer isn't because, well, we have to because of SOX or NIST or ISO or various other regulations, which are guidelines to how we do get compliant. But the reason why we should protect our systems, protect our processes and our people is not so that we have a good audit report card. It's really so that we protect our organizations, right? And it seems like every other month I get a notification that some other type of cyber event or something has occurred. And I'm within KPMG and even in previously in my career, I'm usually part of the team that folks call whenever an event happens to help to diagnose what would happen and more importantly, how can we prevent it in the future? So you've seen all these type of headlines. Oh, we've got fraud risk, we got cybersecurity risk, and all this other kind of stuff. Let me just give you a few real world examples that have happened just in the last couple of years without going into specifics about the particular organizations or clients, just to let you know what is possible, right? I'll start with some of the obvious ones. So, some of the obvious things are around cyber breaches and ransomwares and things like that. So, notably, in the last couple of years, we've had a number of organizations who, through social engineering, which is essentially a cyber attack mechanism where you are playing on people's emotions and psychology in order to gain access to stuff that you're not supposed to gain access to. So it's one of the most prevalent type of cyber attacks out there, one of the most successful ones. And the best way I like to describe it is if you've ever seen that magic show Now You See Me, there's a scene in there with Woody Harrelson right at the beginning where he's talking with his husband and wife characters and he's trying to pry out this information by looking at facial features and the ticks that the guy is doing and the way he holds his hands. That's a dramatic version of social engineering, right? It's where you play on people's emotions, usually by being excessively nice, outside of the opposite, to pull on the heartstrings to get your passwords reset, to get access to accounts that you're not supposed to have access to, right? So, most recent example, somebody called a service desk and gave probably a great sob story, something to the effect of, "Oh man, I'm about to lose my job. I got to send this email out to my boss. I've lost all my access. I'm going nuts. I can't remember any of my stuff. Please, please, can you help me just reset my account? Here's my email. Just send me the new password to this email." And the person was probably like, "Oh no, no, it's against the rules. You got to give me this pants." I'm like, "Oh please, I'm about to lose my job." Blah blah. And then eventually they wear them down and they say, "All right, fine. Give me your new email address. Let me send you the password and all that kind of stuff." Overly dramatic explanation, but that happens and it has happened. And now that person is able to reset the password, get into the four walls using the account of their chosen target, and now they're able to run amok within the organization. That running amok that's the part that I specialize in, right? So training the teams and building processes and everything about preventing social engineering, that is what I would traditionally call traditional cybersecurity. And that's a whole field onto itself. But once they are into those four walls, mitigating what they can do is what we refer to as application layer security. So now that an attacker has gained access to a supplier admin account or a financial GL specialist account, limiting what they can do and having controls in place that monitor what they are doing, that's application layer security. That's the stuff that we're working on. That's what we're going to be talking about and focusing a lot on today. So you've heard those type of examples. Other examples that are not as well published, and it creates some interesting conversations, would be I had another example where a client came to us who had one of their suppliers got hacked. So this particular organization had a lot of suppliers who provided goods and services to them, and they set up a supplier portal where the supplier can go in there, enter all their banking information, their ACH information for direct deposits, all this other kind of stuff, and then they submit invoices and POs and everything through this portal. Well, a hacker hacked or a threat hacked that particular supplier, got in there, changed all the information on the supplier side, and now anytime the organization was submitting payment to the supplier, that payment was getting routed to the malicious agent instead of to the intended supplier. It was detected, it was caught, it was fixed. But now the question was, well, the supplier was supplying all the goods and services as agreed. The organization was providing all the payments as agreed. It just was going to the wrong folks. So who ultimately is accountable? There's still a debt that needs to be paid. Who does the investigation, the fraud detection to maybe get those funds back? Who foots that bill? Is it the organization or is it the supplier? The answer to that question is not necessarily the scope of this, but it's an interesting aspect that at the end of the day, the cyber event didn't lead into a traditional ransomware or the shutting down of systems or the matrix style effects that you see in TV. Instead, it created a pretty interesting legal question of who is ultimately responsible for this. So these are the type of things that can go wrong, right? Now we all know what could happen. Uh, and it's no surprise, right? Every single study that we see, every single trend that we have, whether you're at an internal or an external conference, whether you're at a technology conference, the top trends in risk are always usually cybersecurity, both present tense and in the future. As malicious agents get more and more sophisticated, especially with the prevalent use of AI and a lot of the different risks that come with AI, cyber is going to continue to be one of the biggest trends that we need to be aware of. But what's interesting is this rising trend in human capital. So, human capital in this sense means we are having, as organizations, we are having a difficulty in developing our teams to be able to handle these issues. We have a human problem. We have a resourcing problem, right? A lot of this has to do with the economy and attrition is not quite what it traditionally is. And so we don't have turnover within our teams, which means we're not hiring as much. So there's a lot of various economical factors that factor into that. But we've also seen the rise of more and more specialists versus generalists and kind of a reshifting of what those two groups mean. In the past, specialists were what you wanted. You wanted those individuals who knew everything there was to know about Oracle or Dynamics or whatever the case may be. And so that's the folks that you would hire. Well, nowadays, organizations have multiple technologies. And so we need to now have more generalists. But the problem with the generalists, they know this much and that little depth, right? So it's a balance between we're having difficulty finding, retaining, and training the individuals that we need to be able to secure all of the systems. And then coming back to the topic at hand is what is the bare minimum that we need? Where do we even get started? So that's what I want to talk about now, right? We've talked about all the things that could go wrong. We recognize that we absolutely have security. So now I'm going to say, here's the bare minimum that you have, and it's actually pretty simple. So what you need is you need to make sure you have quadruple authentication at every entry point within your digital system and ideally within your external walls as well. Things like DNA swabs really go a long way, making sure that your folks are protected. Biometric authentication, hey, it's on the rise. Those little retina scans, they work wonders. Daily user access reviews. I know how much we love user access reviews. Well, guess what? We need to do more. We need to do them all day, every day. Obviously, hopefully, y'all recognize I'm joking. By no means do any of this. And if you screenshot me saying that this is what you should do, I will find you. This is a joke. Don't do this, right? The point is, there are going to be a lot of folks out there, consultants like myself, technology providers that are going to say, hey, buy this tool and it will solve all of your problems, or implement this process and it's going to solve all of your problems. And they might be right. But I want to arm you with what are the real things that you could do when you have limited resources and you want to be able to have a baseline of application layer security and integrated controls and also be able to adapt for the future. So let's talk about some golden rules. Number one, we need to make sure that we have a separation physically and through everything else about the configuration and maintenance of our application systems, right? So regardless of what your application systems are, in this case, I mean your financial systems like Dynamics or BC or anything like that, your HR systems, whether it be through a managed third party like an ADP, or it's something that you own as an on-prem system. There needs to be this separation of responsibilities between these things. The individuals who are responsible for configuring and maintaining the systems should not, that's what they should be focusing on, right? They should not be doing financial transactions, even initiating financial transactions. Now, there may be some gray areas within that, right? So, one of the most common gray areas that I often see is these more senior individuals within our organizations who have been with the organization from the start, and they want and often need the ability to do certain power user style activities. For example, let's say that we are posting a bunch of transactions every year. So we'll say invoices and GL transactions. And every once in a while, we need to do a bulk upload of, say, 100 some odd transactions. Now, anything that is usually done in bulk is one of those sensitive access things. And this is kind of going into number two around the initiation and approval of transactions. But I often recommend that anything that you're doing in bulk, because of the mechanisms that most application systems empower users to do things in bulk, aka it's usually bypassing most of the workflow controls that are in place if you're doing them versus if you're doing it individually. We usually say that that type of activity is elevated, sensitive access, but that particular one does not necessarily make sense that it would only be the owners of the system that's doing it because it's still a transactional task. So it makes sense that it belongs to the business, but it should be limited into who should be able to do that. But those individuals should also not be the same ones who are, for example, provisioning security. Anyone who is provisioning security to your organization, that needs to be their role. They could share that role with the developers or the application administrators. That's fine. But they should not be responsible in any way for initiating or approving transactions. That's just too much access. So, bare minimum number one, you have individuals who own the keys to the kingdom in terms of the configuration and the maintenance of the system, and those individuals should not have the ability to initiate or approve any type of transactions. So it gets to the point of, all right, who should initiate and approve those transactions? And is it the same person who initiates and approve a transaction? So the first answer is pretty simple. It's our traditional business users, right? So then it comes to, all right, should we enforce an SOD policy that says the same person cannot initiate and approve transactions, right? You have to have a team that does nothing but initiate transactions and another team that all they do is approve transactions. Now, in the past, this was an SOD conflict that every one of the big four and most of the other consulting firms had on their list of golden rule SODs, right? Creating and posting GL transactions, for example. They always said you cannot have the same person to create and approve a transaction. What that really meant was that you should not have someone who's creating and approving their own transactions. That's really what the intent of that SOD was. It got muddled over the years, but that was the original intent. And that's still valid. There are notable exceptions in self-approval and approval thresholds and level of authority limits. Those are examples. So there are notable exceptions where it's okay, where someone is able to create and self-approve or auto-approve their own transaction. But in general, for the majority of your larger transactions, the person who initiates it should not be the same person who approves it. That doesn't mean that from a security perspective, the approver can't also have creation ability. That's fine. And the initiator can also not have approval. That's fine. It's just they should not be creating and approving their own. Now, from a security perspective, how would you enforce that? You kind of wouldn't through security. That's more through workflow. Now, different systems handle workflow differently. For example, in a lot of the Oracle Stack systems, you actually apply a security role to the user account, and then that drives workflow. So systems do it in different ways. But that one is more of an example of approval, or I'm sorry, a workflow approval. However, if for some reason you don't have workflow approval, then that becomes a scenario where you really should evaluate if you are able to separate individuals into being able to initiate a transaction or to approve a transaction, or at the very least, monitor periodically all of the approved transactions, create a VLOOKUP, do a Power BI, right, however you want to visualize it, and look to make sure that in scenarios where it's the exact same initiator and approver, that transaction was appropriate. Right? I know I've been talking for a bit. Any questions or anything as we're going? Again, feel free to throw them in the chat or speak up as we go. All right, so that's the first two. Then we've got a little bit an extension of the first one is, all right, so now we have separated our individuals within our application stack, and we now have a group that is dedicated to only making configuration changes, right? So our financial users are not able to make configuration changes anymore. It's all handled through our central IT team, whatever that team may be called. So we're good to go, right? Not necessarily. The other bare minimum that you should have is a monitoring mechanism to monitor your key configuration changes, right? And this is one where it's one that's often overlooked. So I'm going to walk through what the ideal scenario is, and then we'll talk about how we could potentially tailor that down to the bare minimum. So the ideal scenario is you have two different environments for all of your application systems. You have a production level environment and you have a lower environment, whether that be a dev, test, QA, or all of the above, right? The point is you have one with production live data, and you have one with non-production data. Anytime a change is requested for key configuration changes. Now, what do I mean by key configurations? These are things that drive your various transactions and that drive the workflow stuff that we were just talking about, right? If your workflow is driven by routing based off of level of authority approval limits and all that kind of stuff, those are configurations in the system which are key to how your business processes run. That's a key configuration change. Things like a logo on the top left screen or the color schemes or filtered lists, things like that, those aren't really key. Make those changes all you want. Things that impact the financials, what I mean by key configuration changes. So the ideal scenario is that when one of those changes is requested, you have a ticketing mechanism that someone submits a request to make this change. That request is reviewed and approved for appropriateness. Obviously, the person submitting the request is not the same one who approves the request. There should be a little bit of a separation there. And then that request goes through its development processes in which the change is made into a lower environment first. It's tested and validated. And then once it's approved, it is then pushed into production. The ticket is closed by validating that the change in production is appropriate per the original request. That key statement there is that that's following a changed request. The other half of that, and this is the one that is most often overlooked, is that periodically we should be monitoring and cataloging all of the changes that are happening. And we don't do that by looking at all the requests that were submitted. We do that by independently tracking through audit logging and other mechanisms all of the changes that are directly happening in the system. And then we tie that back to the ticket requests. And like I said a few times, this is one of the ones that's most often overlooked, and it kind of results in a lot of the audit findings that organizations do a pretty good job of having that ticketing system in place and then having a process by which they review all the tickets and then they review the logs to make sure the tickets match up to the entries in the log. But there's not that reverse, reviewing all the entries in the log to make sure there's a ticket. That's the part that's most often overlooked and results in a lot of the efficiency. So that's what we're talking about here. Even if you don't have all of that ticketing system that we just talked about, at the very least, you need that other part. where you are monitoring all of the changes that are happening in your system that are related to your key configurations. And you are making sure that all of those changes are appropriate in some fashion. Now, that's why you have the ticketing system. That's how you prove that it was appropriate, because it had a reviewer and approver and all that stuff, right? Absence of that, it's still the bare minimum is you need to be tracking all of those changes. It's just that you're going to have a little bit more of a manual process to say, let's say, once a quarter or every month, you're reviewing all these changes being made to your key configurations. Two or three of them pop up. You don't have that ticketing system in place. You got to go look at the last upward ID, right, to determine who made that change, track down that person, figure out why it was done, right? It's a little bit of an investigation, but at least you have the evidence. At least you have the logs of what is being monitored. It's retroactive and after the fact, sure, but a bare minimum. And I'm talking about you just don't have anything today and you want to get something stood up tomorrow. At least start monitoring those audit logs of those changes. And every system has it. They come in various forms. There's plenty of third-party tools out there as well that help to visualize all of that. But one of the main reasons I'm not talking about all of those various third-party tools is that I strongly believe that the first step is making sure you have a process in place, making sure you have the people and the process in place that you're doing all of this. Then once you figure out a process that works for you and works for your organization, then you can go to technology providers or managed service providers or wherever the case may be, say, hey, this is my process. Boom, tech enable it. How can you make it better? Right? That's much better than buying a tool or buying a managed services and converting your business model into what fits for them. So just another little tidbit there. Okay, then the other one is around the approval of financially relevant transactions. Now, this it may seem pretty obvious, but you gotta make sure that there is a review and approval process for relevant transactions. Relevant will mean differently to you than it will be to the person on your right or left, right? It has to do with your business, your materiality thresholds, if you're relevant for SOX or whatever the case may be. Relevant is going to be relative to y'all. But there needs to be some type of approval process, right? And again, it goes back to what we talked about before, that difference between individuals who are able to create as well as approve transactions. But there are many mechanisms and many automated ways where transactions can be automatically approved and that you don't have that separate approval step. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That can be good. There just has to be proven reasons and rationales for why that has been configured and set up in that way, right? And that reasoning and that logic can act as the evidence for saying, all right, this is this approval mechanism. It's because of XYZ reasons, right? Hopefully that makes sense. We talked a little bit about, what are the bare minimums. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of what are the strategies for how we would go about identifying what these bare minimums are, how we would go out and start to build this out, and kind of what does that look like, right? So I mentioned a few times that a lot of this has to do with your organization, the way you run your business. So we have to understand things like, how is our teams structured today, right? Who are the individuals who are approving transactions? Who are the individuals who are initiating? Who are the individuals that are maintaining our system configurations? And then ask ourselves, is that appropriate, right? Based on the things that we talked about today, does it make sense for them to do it? And then we start to identify who are the correct folks in that role. So I'll give you an example. So I had a client who it was a fairly large organization, and they had a lot of folks, but this one particular team only had about 3 people on it. And to put it into perspective, it was a financially relevant business team, and the other teams would have 10 to 12 folks, but this one only had 2 or 3. And the reasoning for it was that it was one of the older teams that had been around the longest, and the folks on it were rock stars. They were just awesome. They were able to wear 2 or 3 hats, and they were rocking and rolling, right? It made sense. It worked, right? So the leadership at never made the call to expand that team because it was working. Well, we worked with that client, and we got to know those individuals, and those individuals, they're rock stars, but they were hurting. They were saying, "Man, this takes me so much time. I spend 6 or 8 hours out of my week to do this one governance related task. I can do it. I've been doing it. I don't have a problem doing it, but boy, I could do a lot of my normal job if I didn't have to do this," right? You start replicating that across all your teams, and you start to discover that keeping there may be opportunities to expand your team, allow them to do more of their day-to-day job, which might increase profitability or sales or whatever, just depending on what their role is. And by doing that, not only are you going to do that, increase all those benefits, but you're also going to be reducing your risk exposure too. So it's a lot about understanding what is your business processes, working with a trusted advisor or working with some technology like process mining and all this other kind of stuff to understand what are my end-to-end processes, how do my transactions flow, who are my people, who's touching what, building out that RACI, that process flows, whatever you want to call them, and then start to identify where our potential gaps are and where our opportunities are. And then map that against where do you want to be in the future, right? Maybe you have this M&A strategy where you're wanting to grow and acquire different other entities or expand into other territories, right? The more you understand how you are structured today and how that M&A strategy or whatever it is, expansion strategy fits into where you want to go to the future, allows you to start to develop these processes that will adapt for your growth. And I'll give you an example as it relates to the number 3 around developing your SOD strategy, right? So when you start to factor in the where do we want to go in the future, you can start to say, all right, I know that at some point in time, I want to be talking to private equities or I want to go public. And I know I'm going to have to enforce certain SODs, right? And I know I'm going to have to do, all right, separation of initiation and approval of transactions. Great. So let me map that out. That's going to become one of my goalposts, right? And maybe you just leave it at that. Say, this is my SOD rule, initiating GL transactions and opening and closing pay periods. I don't want one person to do that same thing. I'm going to live with it today. I'm going to build some monitoring controls to monitor who's doing it, but this is my goal, right? Start to build that SOD rule set out and that SOD strategy, and that becomes a framework for how you start to move forward. And then it comes into, and this is the really cool part that I could talk to days about, is you start to design your application layer security within your specific applications for this growth strategy, right? So I've developed and I have a few articles on my LinkedIn. You're welcome to go check out. I have this methodology that we employ called the identity profile methodology. And this is kind of what I'm talking about, that methodologies like that and similar ones as well, if you employ a strategy for how you're designing your application security, you can start to do some of that groundwork today to say, hey, we're an organization of 25 folks or 30 folks. We're going to go ahead and design the application layer security so that we're ready for when we're 1,000 or we're 10,000, right? So you start to build it out, all these different roles, you build it out into the building blocks. And then in today's world, you're still going to have a little bit of over provisioning, and that's fine. But you've invested in the time now to make those changes, and now you're ready for the future. Because making those changes and laying that foundation when you're an organization of 25 some odd folks is significantly easier than trying to rework when you're an organization that's significantly larger. So evaluate your current state application security designs and start to think through more modern strategies or different strategies like the identity profile mechanism or RBAC strategies or anything like that to start to determine do we have something that's adaptable for growth and how can we get to that destination. And then, like I mentioned before, I'm strongly believe that we have to have the people and the processes in place first before we talk about any technologies. But once we get there, now let's start talking about all the cool stuff, right? Let's talk about the Gen AI tools, the data mining tools, the risk mining tools, all these data analytics stuff, right? Now let's start, now that we know what our process is, both present tense and in the future, we know where we want to take our people. Now let's start tech enabling. And there's a plethora of ones, of course, out there that do all of that. So I know we talked a whole lot. I talked relatively quick. I should have mentioned that at the beginning. Um, any questions or anything about what we have discussed today?
Christian, I had a couple that came through.
Sure.
So the first one is, how should we be thinking about leveraging AI for security and controls related activities?
That is a great question. A very, very good question. So there's a lot of different dimensions to how we can use AI. So the most common thing that we talk about AI in the last year has to do with generative related AI. So Gen AI is exactly as the name sounds. It's hooked up to a large language model. You have a data set that you train it. It hooked up to a large language model like a like a OpenAI, ChatGPT style, and you're able to ask it questions based on the data set it's hooked up to, and it comes up with generative style answers based on how you've trained it. We are using this at KPMG, and I know other consulting companies as well are using similar strategies to develop access controls to help evaluate existing risk and control matrices and things like that. So one of the common strategies as it relates to security design is helping to evaluate your current state security, right? So number 4 on here says assess application security design. What you could do is you could get an extract from your existing system that shows all of your users, all of your roles, and maybe a description of what all of these roles are granting their access to, or ideally, a list of all the entitlements or all the privileges that make up those roles, and those entitlements and privileges have descriptions next to it, right? So you have this flat file or an Excel file with all of this various information, all of your users, their assigned roles, and descriptions of what those roles are granting access to. Data set number 1. Data set number 2 is your SOD rule set and your SOD strategy, right? And this could be in both a functional or a technical format. If it's in a functional format, it means in plain English, these are my rules. A user should not be able to process a journal and open and close a GL financial period, right? That's a functional description. Or a technical description might be they should not be able to do this specific entitlement or collection of entitlements and have these collection of entitlements at the same time. Put all of that into a matrix. That's your data set number 2. Now you can input both of these data sets into a large language model and do interpretive analysis against it. Say, all right, I want you to evaluate based off of this SOD framework. I'm going to give you my definition of an SOD and what it means, and I'm going to give you the raw data. I want you to do a preliminary evaluation and give it a persona. Say, I want you to act as if you're a risk consultant from KPMG or an auditor from KPMG. I want you to perform an audit of these 2 data sets using the SOD rule set as your frame of reference. Put those 2 into it, and you're going to get some amazing results. Is it going to be 100% accurate? I wouldn't trust that. Trust but verify, right? But that can start giving you an evaluation and doing some of this evaluation of your security designs. And you can use this strategy for a lot of different things. That's how we're using AI. That's one example. Other examples might include in the actual design of security, the evaluation of business process flows, the automation of testing of design and testing of effectiveness of controls. We're using AI for doing that. The AI, there's a lot of answers that AI can provide. The last thing I'll say about AI, though, is you got to make sure that you have a trusted AI program, right? And I'm happy to send out a whole bunch of information after this to anyone who's interested, or y'all can reach out to me on LinkedIn about it. I mean, KPMG has published a lot of stuff around this topic, but you got to make sure that when you start to deploy AI across your organization, that you are aware of the pros and cons. And just like what we did back in the day with RPA bots, right? Remember that big surge 6 or 7 years ago where everybody was building RPA bots? Everybody was sending out regulations and, hey, beware, here's what can and can't go wrong with RPA. Same deal, right? There's plenty of policies. Just recently, an ISO policy came out about the 47,001, I think, 47001 came out about AI. Don't quote me on that number. I think it's something like that. So there's already regulations and ground rules and frameworks coming out about it. So just make sure you're aware of that and have a strategy in mind before you start going super wide in your adoption of AI across your organization.
Okay, thank you. Another one that came through. What criteria would you advise to use to evaluate third-party risk management tools?
That's a great question. That's a good one. So I'm going to turn it on its head, turn that question on its head a little bit. So a lot of my clients come to me with similar questions to that, say, hey, we're thinking about buying XYZ tool. Can you give me some questions that I should ask the vendor to help evaluate if I'm getting a good deal, right? Or can you be a part of the demo to make sure that what they're saying this tool can do is really going to be what it's going to do in actuality, and it's not just a vaporware type of deal. And there's certainly there's certain criteria that you should absolutely keep in mind to it, and I will answer that. But before I say that, I would say before you purchase any tool, the one thing I would recommend is make sure you clearly understand the problem statement that tool is seeking to solve. And that the reason I say that is because similar vein to the AI thing we were just talking about, a lot of organizations are going out of their way and buying AI tools and building AI prompts and all this other kind of stuff, similar to how they were building RPA bots back in the day, just to say that they have RPA bots or just to say that they have a library of AI prompts. But they're not really clear on what the problem that is that they're solving with these prompts. And in a lot of cases, they're creating prompts for problems that don't exist. They're creating solutions for problems that don't exist. So going back to the emphasis of your question, the number one criteria that I would use is what is your problem statement that you're trying to solve by tech enabling through a third-party tool, right? Is it you do not have a centralized repository of all of this information, right? I've got artifacts that are sitting on people's laptops. I've got artifacts in Google Drives, Microsoft Teams, and it's just all decentralized. And I just need a centralized location to store everything and then iterate on it there. Right. There's a plethora of stuff, and maybe it's not even a third-party tool. Maybe it's something like a centralized Microsoft Teams or Google Drive or something like that, right? Or maybe it's I need to tech enable the walkthrough and the remediation process. I want to hold my first line accountable for providing management responses to all of my tests that I'm doing, and I want them to have a centralized location to be able to log in and give their responses directly there versus tracking everything through email and all this other kind of stuff, right? So that could be your problem statement, in which case you're looking more at the audit boards and the Workivas and the Archers of the world, right? So that was my ultimate answer would be make sure you understand the problem statement. What are the pain points that you have today, both from yourself and from your stakeholders? And then share those pain points with the third-party vendors that you're looking at, or again, with a trusted consultant who can guide you through that process. And then, most importantly, make sure that you get a demo and you say, I want you to demonstrate how you're going to solve this specific problem. You will be surprised at how many technology vendors there are that if you go to them and say, hey, I don't want to see your boilerplate demo, I just want to see you demo this one thing, they can have challenges doing that sometimes. That's a pretty good indication. Um, Now, there's a plethora out there who would gladly and are up to the challenge. But the point is, make sure you have a clear objective of the problem that you're trying to solve and that they demonstrate the solution to that specific problem. Does that make sense? Can I answer your question on that?
Yes, great answer.
Perfect.
And they said thank you.
Perfect.
So if anybody else has any more questions, please get those in so we can get Christian to answer them. I do have another question
Mhm.
that came up. What are non-SOX regulatory requirements we need to consider?
So not non-SOX requirements that we would need to consider. So SOX is all about making sure that we have ICFR, right? Internal controls over financial reporting. So that's all about making sure that anytime we have a transaction, that those transactions are reviewed and approved for appropriateness and that they are accurate, right? That is the premise of SOX. SOX over the years have expanded to more and more IT related requirements that enforce that same thing. But SOX has always been more focused on the business aspect with a lighter touch to the IT side to just say, hey, make sure it makes sense for ICFR, right? So other strategies, though, on the IT side are things like NIST or ISO standards. Those are the ones that start to touch more of the cyber things, right? So, for example, when it comes to comes to SOX type regulations and things like that, as it relates to SODs, the things that we were talking about before, it's merely defined as there needs to be an appropriateness review of the security objects that are assigned to users, right? Another way to say it is make sure that the stuff that's assigned to users is appropriate, right? That can be interpreted a lot of different ways. And when it comes to bare minimum for SOX and everything else, that means user access reviews done at some interval that makes sense for your organization based off of how many people you have, how often you're hiring folks, and things like that. And that could simply mean I'm going to send a list of my users with all of their roles, like their top level roles, a description of what the role provides in functional terms, right? And I'm going to send it to my role owners, and they're going to say yes or no, this is appropriate, right? That'll pass for a baseline ICFR based UAR, user access review. However, if you look at that from a security perspective, or from a NIST perspective, from a cyber perspective, that's not enough. And the reason is simple. If I give you a role and I'm operating under the assumption that you have a system where a role is made up of other stuff, right? Like entitlements. So in Oracle Cloud, it would be duty roles, and PeopleSoft, it would be permission lists, and Salesforce is permission sets, right? Every system has a different word, right? Workday is security groups. A role is made up of stuff. If you're only giving that role to the business owner to say, hey, approve the appropriateness of this, that business user doesn't know what makes up that role. They just know it by the description of it. Well, as security professionals, we know that I could change whatever I want underneath that role. As long as I don't change the name of it, as long as I don't change the description of it, I can make it a super user role if I wanted to. There's nothing stopping me. They're approving the name of the role. So that's why other standards say, no, 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 you need to do an entitlement level review, right? You need to get to the bottom base layer of what these roles are made up of so that the user knows everything that it's doing, and they're reviewing line by line all the entitlements that make up for it. That's a little overkill for SOX. Well, you can make an argument for it, right? Some would say it is, some would say it's not. But from a security perspective, from a cyber perspective, we absolutely need to know to the very fine detail exactly what these roles are granting access to. So I'm happy to share, and we have published. I'm sure uh, uh, Angie and uh, Trish have some material as well about what are those specific non-SOC standards that you should be aware of. There's a plethora out there, but it's the same deal, right? Don't go overboard. Evaluate what the intent of them is, and start small. Start with maybe a handful of the NIST ones, handful of the ISO ones, and say, all right, we're going to lay the foundation first, get our processes in place. Then over time, we're going to add more and more and more and more.
All right, Christian, I believe that's all the questions that we have for you today. Thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. I hope everyone got a lot of takeaways out of the presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate y'all's time today. As I mentioned at the beginning, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. KPMG and Angie and Trish, we all go way back. We work a lot together on various engagements. So I look forward to potentially working with y'all in the future.
All right. Well, thank you again, Christian. And for everyone on our webinar today, thank you for taking the time out to join us. And I also just want to point out that you can check out our resources page on our website, and that's innovia.com/resources to quickly access all of your Business Central content and events. And if you have any further questions, you can give us a shout out at info@innovia.com with any questions that you may have. All right. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you very much, Christian. And we look forward to seeing you again soon on another Innovia webinar. Take care, everyone.